on the reasoning behind concerns of NCCC over the years now. And then we have another session of discussion about that. So, welcome, Shane. Thanks heaps for participating. It's highly appreciated. And here you go.
Well, thanks, Joachim. Good evening, everyone. Great to see you all, and thanks for the invitation to come along. I thought I would try and keep my remarks briefish so we've got time for both discussion of these topics, but also if anyone wants to go questions on other topics, I'll do my best. I thought I would start first by talking about how to deliver public and affordable housing of the two topics, and then I'll come to effective community consultation second. Certainly in terms of housing, it is a key focus for the Greens this term in the Assembly. You will have seen at the last election we had a number of key policies, and I'll come back to those, but we're really working on the ideas that we need enough public and community homes so that we don't have unreasonable wait times. Right now, we are seeing even those on the most urgent waiting list having to wait months and months to get into public housing in circumstances where they're often fleeing family and domestic violence and other inappropriate living circumstances. So clearly we don't have enough. And I think over a couple of decades now, we have seen a significant underinvestment in public housing at both a state and territory level, territory in our case, but also from the federal government. We're starting to see some turnaround. But we also know that the waiting list has grown in the last 12 months. We asked what it was at the end of last year, and it was just under 3,000. It's now over 3,500. So in just 12 months, we've seen a roughly 14% growth in the public housing waiting list, which speaks to a range of both not enough housing and also the cost of living pressures that many in the community are clearly facing. We also want to, outside of the specific public and affordable housing, but we want to see homes that Canberrans can afford. And I think this is important because of the obvious equity reasons, the intergenerational issues we're seeing. And I think we need to think about affordability in a range of ways. That includes the running costs, so it goes to things like energy efficiency and the like. And we also want to see homes in suburbs and a city that people want to live in. And for us, that really goes to ideas of being close to services, being in a neighbourhood where you know people, obviously access to great green spaces and those sort of things. So that's there's some driving principles for us in how we're approaching it. At the last election, you saw we took a policy to build and buy 10,000 public homes over the next 10 years. It was an ambitious policy, but we got it costed. We knew what it would cost. And we felt that was, I think a lot of people thought it was a lot, but we think it reflects both the numbers we need and reflects that underinvestment we've seen for a while. And that was why we felt that scale was needed. You will have also seen and recall our proposal to develop the whole of Thoroughbred Park as a suburb, not just the bit around the edge that the racecourse wants to put in to make some money, but to create a whole community that also includes shops and a school and other community services, so that you're actually creating a place where people can live their lives, not just be put in an apartment on the edge of the racecourse. So there, again, I remind of those because I think they're reflective of the sort of approach we are trying to take to the issue of housing generally, and specifically the sort of public and community housing. In this term, look, there's some key issues we've been working on. One has been to actually try and maintain the rent relief fund. This is a really important program run by CARE. It was set up while I was the minister, and what it did was provide up to 4 weeks rent for people who are at risk of losing their tenancies. It was a really great way of making sure those people who actually had a tenancy right now, if they had some unfortunate incident where they lost their job or they had an unexpected car repairs and they suddenly found themselves in financial straits they weren't normally in, would not lose their tenancy. And this was really important in the context of the long wait for public housing. We need to keep as many people as we can in the tenancies they're already in.
Jane, how was that project called?
It's called was called the Rent Relief Fund. It was a
Okay.
maximum payment of up to $2,500, and it was being administered by Care Financial, which was a great partnership because people not only got the grant, but they also got linked up with Care, who helped them with financial counselling and a whole lot of other things as well. So it was a really effective program. And we've seen 20 odd community organisations sign up to a letter saying the government should keep it. We haven't won that argument yet, but we're still onto it. We've certainly been pursuing the government over their housing numbers. And the reason I say that is you'll have seen the ALP have put out a range of targets that they've got, certain numbers of public and community housing, overall housing numbers for the city, but there's no targets and timelines in there. So we don't know if they're trying to build 500 by the end of this year or 1,000 or whatever. And I think that lack of an evident plan and stage progression is concerning for us. Through Joe Clay, we've moved in the Assembly to create an urban growth boundary. We think it's really important that the city does not keep sprawling outwards, and in sprawling outwards, consuming valuable farmland or valuable remnant bushland. That will have a big impact on the shape of the city, but I think it's doing things like protecting the western edge, protecting some of those grasslands and woodlands that we do still have left. We also are starting some work on inclusionary zoning. Now, that's basically a term that means when a proponent wants to develop a site, there has to be a certain amount of public and or affordable housing built into it. It's in the zoning requirements. We think this is a really critical way of both getting the properties built, but also making sure they get included in developments. And you may have seen my recent comments calling on the Ainslie Football Club to put some public and or affordable housing into their development. They have no plans for that at the moment. And it goes to the point, Joachim, you made around essential workers. What it means is that even the staff who are working at the Ainslie Football Club are unlikely to be able to afford to live in the development that the Ainslie Football Club is building.
Yeah.
And the response we're getting from people is, well, we don't have to do that. There's no requirement. And the government says we can't force anyone to do it because there's no requirement. And so this is why we're now working on inclusionary zoning legislation, which will require it. We've also been questioning the financial model of some of the work the government is doing around affordable housing. So they've got subsidies for affordable housing where the proponent builds the affordable housing and the government gives them an ongoing subsidy each year. That's for a maximum of 15 years under that scheme. And so we're really worried about essentially a bit of a cliff in 15 years' time where we find ourselves back in perhaps the same problem we've got now. So we think there's some real question marks over those sort of models. One last thing I'd mention is some of you may have seen there's been an inquiry by the Legal Affairs Committee, which I'm on, and I initiated this inquiry to look into the rules around strata properties. With more and more people living in strata conditions, this is a really important area of law reform. We got a lot of submissions to the inquiry, around 150, which for an Assembly inquiry, and they're all unique. These were not form letters or anything. It was lots and lots of issues came in. And so the committee is just analysing that at the moment. But things like getting a strata commissioner are a really important development in this space. So that's just a few issues on housing. I'm happy to come back to the specifics of any of those. On the issues of effective community consultation, look, I guess I was going to make one observation. Certainly last term where there were some Greens ministers, we may have got criticism for some things, but we certainly never got criticised for lack of consultation. And so I say that because it's in our DNA to try and do these things well and to consult fairly and consult openly. And so, yes, we share frustrations around some of these processes which perhaps don't allow enough time or which don't seem particularly genuine. One thing we were very pleased about last term was to get rid of call-in powers out of the planning laws. I think these have long been a bugbear of a process where the minister could just decide to cut off all of those processes. And it's been replaced with a requirement that what's now a priority project must come before can come before the Assembly as a disallowable instrument. I think this puts some power back to the Assembly. We get a lot of talk about the independent planning system, but my personal view is there is a role for the Assembly to be involved in some of these decisions because the independent planning process doesn't necessarily pick up the nuance of community expectations and the like. And so that was something we were pleased to deal with. In terms of the priority projects bill that's coming before the Assembly now, again, Joe's been working on this for us, but we have secured an agreement for amendments to put a sunset clause into the legislation. So to make sure it doesn't continue endlessly, but it's got a timeline at which the legislation will cease to exist unless the Assembly deliberately extends it. And we think that's an important mechanism to both enable some potentially speeding up of planning processes given the housing shortages we face, but not just having a set and forget piece that in 10 years' time is kind of there and not doing the job it was supposed to. So that sunset clause will put a time limit on it. We've also inserted some requirements for environmental and Indigenous heritage assessments. The last comment I'll make is, in a number of conversations I've had with community groups recently, there is some frustration about the lack of steps or the lack of community options in the new planning legislation. We also have some frustrations on that. We tried to retain pre-DA consultation, but we were unsuccessful in that when the planning laws went through last term. So we think that we are monitoring how this is going, and we'll be looking for opportunities for both a review of the legislation when it's the right time and to reconsider some of those steps. I'll leave it there. Hopefully that's a quick overview of some of the things that are on my mind and some of the things that, as the Greens, we're thinking about and working on. I'm happy to open the floor up from there.
Thanks heaps, Shane. Any questions?
Or feedback is also welcome.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What's the percentage of the public social housing you propose going to be in the development?
It's a good question. Right now, there is sort of this loose requirement for 15% in some sites of a mixture of it, community, social, and affordable. But we haven't formed a definitive view, and that's the research phase we're in at the moment. But we would want, I think, a minimum of, we sort of generally look at 10% for across Canberra would be about the right amount, and we're currently at 5 to 6% of our housing stock is public housing. Mm-hmm. So 10% would be a minimum.
Yeah. Thank you.
Marianne.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was just wondering, Shane, how many houses, dwellings, or whatever you might like, flats, townhouses, are actually empty over a long period of time that obviously just are being left there as an investment property? I know Sydney and Melbourne have a major issue with this, and is there anything that the ACT government can do about that?
There's two bits to that, Marianne. Certainly when it comes to public housing, they have around 500 properties vacant at any one time, which feels like a lot. We're quite frustrated by that. So that's sort of in the public housing space. Overall, across the city, I've not seen an accurate source of data for how many. We hear a lot of anecdata about, I was chatting to some people the other day about the number in Woden, where you had a lot of new buildings go up and a lot of empty, whether they've been not sold yet or whether they've been sold and not occupied. This is where it gets a bit murky. I think the real interesting part of your question is what can we do about it? We've certainly explored some ideas of vacancy tax, but we haven't found a workable model yet, so I'm open to suggestions.
Mm-hmm. I think that Sydney councils and I think Melbourne councils are trying to work on with the same problem. But, I have no idea where they've got to it or whether they've been able to implement in terms of council guidelines or even legislation. But I think it's a real problem. So good luck.
So Shane, staying with housing in the moment, in overseas, there are major at-scale public housing projects that do not adhere to that theory of salt and pepper, that they should be distributed across the community, rather than, for instance, embedded in large-scale developments like Northbourne Avenue or hopefully Thoroughbred Park or whatever, with large housing estates that people are proud of living in. So where does that salt and pepper policy come from? Do you know?
It's a great question, Yoko. I mean, it's just this sort of Canberra thing. everybody talks about it. I've never heard anybody really question. I think there's been a general acceptance it has been a good idea because it produces a social mix. Many of the government houses, if we go back to the sort of 60s and 70s, were built, you couldn't tell the difference between a government house and a non-government house. And there was that real sense of equity, I suppose, that was built into that approach. What's been very interesting in recent times, chatting to even some of the community organisations like Canberra Community Law who support public housing tenants, the government has a reluctance to put tenants into multi-unit developments in public housing properties because they find managing the body corporate quite challenging. But even groups like Canberra Community Law talk about public housing tenants being discriminated against in those buildings. The body corporate, identifying the government housing thing, making life uncomfortable for tenants in those spaces. Now, these, again, are all anecdotes, but it's an interesting question of what is the right mix. I probably personally favour more of the salt and pepper approach of having it spread around town. If you think back to the history of some of the large apartment blocks and even some of the issues we've got on things like Ainsley Avenue at the moment, you do get a concentration of disadvantage, which creates some social problems.
Yeah. But then, that was never considered in developing the Northbourne Avenue corridor, for instance, to include public housing there.
Agreed.
So the question is, one could extend the salt and pepper approach to large developments like Kingston Foreshore or whatever.
Yep.
And hopefully what's coming in Thoroughbred Park if it becomes a bit more ambitious.
And this is the point of inclusionary zoning legislation, Joachim, is to create a legislative requirement to do that, because we have not been able to achieve it through policy and agitation. So,
Marcus.
Yeah, thanks. Just coming back to the vacant houses. I've noticed there's lots of large sites like the old CSIRO site on Limestone Avenue, which has been sitting vacant for 3 years. There was the bowling club in Braddon, which was demolished about 6 years ago and it's just been sitting vacant. At the southern end of the Ainsley Football Club, they applied to build a childcare centre, but got approval for that about 3 years ago. It doesn't look like they've done anything. At the northern end of the site, yes, they did apply. They spent about almost 10 years trying to get a rezoning at the northern end of the site, and they got that a few months ago, but we haven't seen any development application there. And there's also sites along Northbourne Avenue which are sitting vacant. So while there's this issue of affordability, it seems like developers are just sitting on land, in a sense, land banking this land. I don't know what I assume they're just waiting for property prices to go back up, because property prices in Canberra have been relatively stagnant for the last 3 years. So your idea of sort of a vacancy tax, I think, is potentially a good one to actually encourage these developers to use these sites and actually get some development going if it's already been approved. And it also comes to the idea of one thing I noticed in the sports inquiry that you're sitting on is that a lot of sports groups are asking for reduced rates for their sporting fields. But that, I think, just encourages people to land bank these areas for property development if they don't have a high holding cost for these sorts of sites. I can understand from their perspective, reducing costs encourages them to, allows them to provide sort of reduced sports services, but it also encourages them just to sit on vacant land if they have lower rates. So yeah, a number of issues there, but it seems as if we have enough land in the ACT, but it's just not being used very effectively.
Marcus, there's probably people on this call that know better than I do, but there are a series of provisions around designed to prevent land banking, as you were describing it, just sitting on vacant sites. But I do question them because some of you recall there's a block on Torrens Street, just north of Hague Park, that has been vacant for probably as long as I've lived in that neighbourhood, so 15 years. So I don't know what's going on with that. So there is a question mark about whether these penalties are being enforced. And again, you might have seen we've been doing some work around things like Big Splash to try and make sure that lease provisions are being actually enforced. So I think there's room for better enforcement. I think land banking and then the vacancy of already built apartments are slightly different mechanisms, but I take your point in the broad, which is we should make better use of what we already have.
Amy.
Hey, thanks. This question came into my head when we were talking about public housing and those development questions. This may not be something that you have an answer to, Shane, but here it goes. So there's a proposed development next to where I live. This is 220 Northbourne. That's going to be huge.
Yep. I know this is on the corner at Mac Avenue, yeah?
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. So yeah, like the Northbourne, Wakefield, that one. And then across Lowana from there, there's public housing.
Yep.
And you look at the shadowing that proposed development is going to have, and those folks in that building are going to have zero sunlight over winter for like all of the afternoon. Do developers have to take into consideration the surrounds when they're thinking about solar access, or is it just the apartments in that development? Because from what I can see, that's all they seem to kind of care about, that I don't fully understand this, but it's like a proportion of the apartments that they're proposing have to meet solar access requirements, but it doesn't seem like they have to consider what's happening around. And I'm obviously devastated that those folks across the road are the people that least need to have more utilities bills to keep their places warm. And I'll stop babbling there, but that's the question. Again,
I reckon Jane might know the answer better than me. You're certainly right about they have to do it on their own site. They do have to do the shadow diagrams. What I don't know is how much that gets taken into account in the approval process. So Jane might be able to help us with that one.
In truth, not at all. Yes, it's in the technical specifications and it's ignored.
It's not the answer you're looking for, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a huge frustration that there's no consideration. That's a massive equity implication for folks that are well established there and have no agency to move somewhere else. Like someone that's wealthy enough could go, oh, don't have enough sunlight, I'll go somewhere else now. But it's just going to be cold and miserable and damp issues and mold and all that sort of stuff.
I'm making a note of that one. I'll have a look at that. Thanks.
Jane. You're muted, Jane.
Sorry, I see that there's another person who also has a question. I'll just quickly, I wanted to talk about territory priority projects just briefly. Obviously, there's in Dixon, we've had two big developments, both of which, after several years of work on our part, call-in powers were exercised. That's the Coles Dixon Village and the Common Grand project. And in both cases, we actually were in favour of the call-in powers being exercised at the stage that they were. But of course, call-in powers are not in fact equivalent to a territory priority project, which is essentially about fast tracks. Territory priority projects apply to an entire class of development as opposed to single developments. So I think it's very important to recognize that these are actually quite different animals. And a fast track process, what that does is to extinguish third-party appeal rights overall. And of course, the checks and balances that are in the planning system rely on members of the community or other parties being capable of exercising appeal rights, which are rights for a particular reason. They're about protecting amenity. And for example, as the instance Amy Carrott is referring to with public housing, unless those people are capable of taking it to the tribunal, they have no power. And the truth is that community has actually very little power in the system. So I'm personally concerned about the magnification and it seems to me the tendency we see in Australia to place more and more categories of development into fast tracks.
Yeah, I mean, Jan, I think but with the call-in as well, that also extinguished appeal rights. And certainly in trying to come up with a mechanism and get rid of call-ins, we try to build a number of steps into the TPP process which offset that process and actually provide a degree of community engagement, including through the Assembly. But yes, there is an extinguishment of appeal rights on both fronts. That is true.
Thanks.
Lee.
I was just curious, before Jen, you talk about they just ignore the solo access requirements. And so I wonder is there any consequences if they ignore that?
Goes back to Jane's point about needing to be able to appeal it.
Oh, okay. So you can't, and would that be like can be, I don't know, the government assessment of the DA can that be denied the DA or something, like it just approve that?
The planning authority can exercise its power to approve. At the point where it's approved, the only power anybody else has is to exercise appeal rights.
When they approve that, do they have any basis for such approval if they not meet a solo access requirement?
If they've issued an approval is in effect.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the principal imbalance, and the planning agency is very well connected with the developer and the political spheres, but not very well connected with the community. And so there is an imbalance that is simply through the daily interactions between the bureaucrats and the politicians and the bureaucrats and the developers, while there is no daily interaction with the community.
It's not even should it be about who's connect to who. It should be rules as rules. If it's rules, everyone should follow the rules. It's not about who's connected. It's I don't know. Is that something to do with the new planning reform, the outcome-based approach? Because there's no rules anymore, just depend on who can argue about their case.
Yeah, it makes the situation worse compared to the situation before.
The rules are no longer mandatory.
Yeah.
This is horrible.
Yeah. Look, folks, on this depressing, in this depressing moment, I'd like to call on Jean McGuinn Glynn to